Beaton, and the producer was Carol Smith. And that small matter. We'll hear Agatha work out at the same time tomorrow in the second half of Buried Treasure at the same time.
This is
BBC Radio 4
Extra.
Where next, after hearing Apricots on the Nile all last week, we'll continue to hear Colette Rossant's memoirs in Return to Paris all this week. Once again, the celebrated New York food writer and best-selling author shares some vibrant memories of her teenage years in France after the Second World War, with mouth-watering descriptions of meals that changed her life. The reader is Barbara Flynn.
Je me souviens d'un coin de rue, aujourd'hui disparu.
I am standing on the bridge of a Greek ship, which will take us to Marseille, looking down at the pier. The noise is deafening, and people are running and passing baggage, crying out in Arabic, "Be careful! Turn right! No, I mean left! You idiot! Why can't you be more careful?" as they're loading possessions and themselves onto the deck. The war has been over now for nearly 2 years, and the Mediterranean, which had been mined by the Germans, is now declared safe. I am going back to Paris with my mother to attend a lycée and to see my brother, who spent the war years in France. We are going to live with my maternal grandmother, who's raised my brother. I'm excited to go back to France, where I was born, although quite sad to leave Egypt and my Egyptian grandparents, where I've spent 8 wonderful years. A loud siren pierces the air, and the shouts and cries below intensify. I hear a voice crying, "Samit! Samit!" I look down and see a young boy with a basket on his head filled with samits, the Egyptian version of a soft pretzel. I suddenly remember my first bite of the hot samit topped with roasted sesame seeds when we first came to Egypt. I run down the plank to buy some, while the sailors shout in Greek to come right up as the boat is about to leave. The soft samit tastes wonderful. I didn't know it then, that I would have to wait 25 years to eat another one. The loud siren pierces the air again. It's time for the boat to leave, and the people on the pier below look like ants trying to find shelter. I look up to see my mother smiling and talking to the captain on the upper deck. I feel a pinch in the middle of my stomach as I realise that I will probably not see much of her during the trip. She is already flirting and will probably befriend the other officers who are Greek and Italian. She speaks both languages and will have, I feel sure, a great time becoming the belle of this boat. I want to go back to Cairo. I'm afraid of what lies ahead. What will it be like? I don't even remember my brother. And my French grandmother. What was she like? I have no recollection. I only know stories that I've overheard. My mother and her mother were not close. On the 1st of June 1947, our ship anchors in Marseille. I stand on the bridge looking down onto the pier. The atmosphere is not the same as in Alexandria. Less shouting and pushing, and the pier looks cleaner. My mother is looking for someone in the crowd. "There she is," my mother says, "the tall lady with the hat. Wave, Colette, so she can see you." The boat is slowly unloading. Suddenly my mother screams, "Faites attention! Regardez où vous allez!" Along the plank, an enormous burlap sack is being unloaded. Suddenly the bag rolls and falls with a large thud onto the pier, bursting open. Oh, mon Dieu! There goes the rice. And the kilos of rice that my mother, at her mother's request, had packed to bring to France, where food was still scarce and rationed, had spilled out everywhere. I see people running with paper bags, picking up as much rice as they can. At the bottom of the plank stands Grandmaman Rose. "You're not very tall, she says, but you have very nice hair. Come, let's get to the station and home. The train ride to Paris was slow due to mines on the tracks. During the war, my grandmother told us the cheminots, railway workers, sabotaged the Germans by derailing trains en route to Germany. Not only the trains carrying Jews to concentration camps, mind you, but also French workers who were obliged to work in German factories, she explained. My mother's look turned sheepish, as it often did in the next few months at the mention of what the Jews, and by implication what her mother and son had suffered during the war. I looked at my grandmother's slight smile of satisfaction at having just humiliated her daughter. To dispel this embarrassing moment, I announced loudly that I was famished and could we order lunch. My first meal in France, in a hushed and formally elegant dining car, was a revelation. The menu was absurdly simple. There was a choice of an omelette au finherbe or a sandwich jambon beurre. I chose the omelette and was delighted by the flavours of chives, tarragon and chervil, mingling in the creamy lightness of the eggs, all so new to me. If the food in France was so good even in a train, I thought, I might have a happy life here after all. We arrived in Paris in the late afternoon. The taxi stopped in front of a large green door with brass knobs. "Don't stand there like a statue," my grandmother grumbled. "Pick up a suitcase and follow me." My brother opened the door before we had a chance to knock, and I stood at the threshold staring and immobile. 8 years is a very long time in the life of a 14-year-old. From a cherubic baby brother, he had grown into a tall, thin, mournful adolescent, dressed in ugly brown trousers and a light cotton sweater. Of course, I too had changed, and Eddie stared equally hard at me. My grandmother gently asked Eddie to help his mother with the luggage, while she pushed me inside and led me to a room. I sat on the bed, bewildered, lonely, wondering how my mother greeted my brother. Did they talk? Did they embrace? Was he shy? I looked around. The room was small and spare. A massive armoire with carved doors overpowered and darkened the space. I walked to the window, overlooking the grey, silent courtyard. I missed my own bedroom in Cairo with its picture window overlooking the mango tree that my grandfather had planted when I was born. I was drawn to the kitchen, just as I had sought solace in the kitchen of my Cairo childhood. Georgette was standing over a large frying pan stirring what smelled like garlic, parsley and rich butter. "Come, Colette, come near. Let me look at you again. Are you hungry? Can you wait till dinner, or would you like something now?" I was famished. But what would I ask Georgette for? In Cairo, our cook Ahmed would have heated up a sanbousak, a little pastry baked with cheese, or slathered a pita bread with baba ganoush. I looked at her silently, trying to remember what she was like when I was 6 years old and loved her so much. I remembered going to the market with her. She would urge me to smell the fresh herbs by crushing them between her fingers, saying, "Sniff, Colette. This is fresh rosemary for tonight's chicken." And I would put my nose in her fingers and inhale the lovely fresh aroma of the rosemary. That is what I smelled now. "You have rosemary in that dish. What are you cooking?" "A chicken fricassee with rosemary. Try the sauce," she said, handing me a wooden spoon filled with a light aromatic jus. So delicious. I wanted to tell Georgette about Ahmed in the kitchen in Cairo, but suddenly my grandmother appeared. "There you are," she said. "I knew I'd find you here. Come with me and let's unpack your things." I followed her to my room. But my mother reappeared and said that she would help me unpack my things. At the bottom of my suitcase was the missal that Mère Catherine of the Convent of the Sacred Heart had given me when I left Cairo. I didn't want her to see it, my mother said. She hid the missal under the mattress. Why, I wondered. is she so scared? Later that evening, I went to the bathroom to run my bath. In Cairo, we had showers, but this bathroom had none. I lit the hot water heater and turned the faucet. The water was filling the bath slowly, so I went into my brother's room. He was sitting at his desk, and as I entered, he lifted up his head and said grimly, "Knock at the door next time." "What are you doing? What do you want?" "Nothing. Just to talk." "I can't talk now. I have a test tomorrow, so leave the room. I have to work." I left the room, intending to look for my mother or Georgette, when I heard my grandmother's voice calling my name from the bathroom. "Never," she said as she pointed to the bottom of the bathtub, "never fill the bathtub. Gas is expensive. Only fill it just to there." What a day. Everything I was doing was wrong. I hated Paris, and I wanted to go back to Egypt. The next morning I ran to the kitchen. Eddie was sitting at the table having breakfast, a woman's silk stocking thrust around his head. I burst out laughing. "What's that for?" I asked. "You look like a clown." My brother got up and said, "You stupid girl," and rushed out of the room. Georgette told me to sit down. She put a bowl filled with steaming café au lait in front of me, and next to it a long piece of baguette spread with butter and jam. "Eat, and I will tell you why you should not laugh at Eddie." The bread was fresh, crunchy and tasty, the raspberry jam rich, and the coffee smoothed with chicory. "Eddie had a hard time here during the war, and you know he missed you and your mother. Do you know that his hair is so curly that it stands up after he washes it? He has to put this net on his head to flatten it. If not, they will make fun of him." I understood, and thought about my cousins in Cairo, who all had tight curls. I missed them desperately, but I promised not to laugh at Eddie any more. As soon as I grew more confident about my surroundings, my grandmother started to send me shopping in the neighbourhood. Rue des Acacias was our shopping street. After the war, you brought your metal pail to the crèmerie, and Madame Blanchette filled it up with milk using a large ladle. Butter was cut with a metal string from a motte, a hill of luscious, yellow, creamy butter. The butcher and the produce stores were next on my trip. I closed my eyes while passing the horse butcher. The store had a large gilded horse head outside. The street ended at Place des Ternes. At the corner was Les Grands Magasins Réunis, a dowdy department store built in the early 1900s, and my grandmother's favourite shop. There she bought her amazing hats topped with birds or flowers and frumpy old-fashioned dresses, everyday dresses she called them. Unfortunately, she bought my dresses there also, so I went around feeling out of fashion and unattractive. No argument would dissuade her. For the first year, the 17th arrondissement, my neighbourhood, became my only world. When I returned after my wedding several years later, I was astonished at how nothing had changed. My mother disappeared more and more often as the days went by, absenting herself from the household and her children's lives. A month after we arrived, my grandmother announced that we would all go to the sea. She chose Biarritz, but as usual, it was my mother who rented and paid for the house. I would be tutored in the morning, and my afternoons would be free to go to the beach and have fun. I thought, my life is looking up.
And Colette's recollections of France continue tomorrow. Return to Paris by Colette Rossant was read by Barbara Flynn, abridged by Penny Lester and produced by Gemma Jenkins. Now we begin a thrilling series set in 1890s Whitechapel that runs all this week and next. Welsh farm girl Megan Evans comes to London to visit her brother, who's running the family's dairy business. But her brother is strangely unwelcoming. This is part 1 of Blood and Milk by Gregory Evans.
Llwyncolfa, Cardiganshire, Wales. 24th of April, 1894. Fy mrawd annwyl. My dear brother, I can hardly believe I shall be seeing you in a mere 4 days. That happy prospect banishes, almost, the trepidation I feel at my first ever visit to London. The reason, of course, that I am now writing in English. I know you've already received several letters from Mam concerning my visit. She has likewise drummed into me how vital it is I keep safe the great sum of money I shall be carrying. Every last penny our family has ever saved, so I'm repeatedly told. I know Mam has long dreamed of expanding our family business. Dad is still chary. So I am pleased that all your hard work there in London means the fulfilment of that dream is finally in sight.
Then good draws, eh? So, Welshman, you and me.
Luke, please, call it a line.
Draws. 9. Can't quit now, Carrier. Know my luck's on the turn.
You'll be amused to hear that Dad insists, in the teeth of all my objections, that I carry his big old pistol with me. The one he claims he won from that American lawman in a poker game. He assures me I may have need of it in Whitechapel, to defend our family fortune, or my honour, or both. On a more serious note, that sorry excuse for a man, Mad Dog Priest, continues to press for my hand in marriage. He called here only yesterday, with flowers for me and flattery for Mam and Beth. I swear, when he had gone, the reek of corruption hung in the air. Your sweet sister Beth sends you her loving regards, as do I. Oh, dearest brother, how I long to see your familiar face, your eager eyes searching me out among the crush at Paddington Station.
Samuel!
Master Luke?
Tell Harry and Bron they're to pour away the last of today's milk, sterilise the crock, take the churns back to the yard.
You're off to meet your sister.
No, you are. Meg's train arrives in Paddington in less than 2 hours.
Before that, Barbara Flynn reads Return to Paris by Colette Rossant, in which the celebrated New York food writer and best-selling author of Apricots on the Nile recalls her life in post-war France, mixing memories of her teenage years with mouth-watering descriptions of meals which changed her life. Today, in part 2, A Promise Broken, Student Life and a Farmer's Market.
Je me souviens d'un coin de rue, aujourd'hui disparu.
On our last night in Biarritz, my world collapsed. We were sitting in the garden. For once, my mother was not out dancing at the casino. As we watched the Mediterranean sun light up the sky with fiery oranges and pinks before it disappeared, she said in a matter-of-fact voice, I think I will go back to Egypt next week. Just like that. I was dumbfounded. She had promised to stay. How could she leave me again? The next weeks passed very quickly. My mother was never home, always shopping for her friends or for herself. Nothing for me. I went shopping with my grandmother. Dresses to go to school, navy blue with a white collar. In France, at that time, dresses for children were by age. My grandmother was dismayed when I tried on the first dress she chose, a child size 14. It was too small. You must lose weight, Colette. You are too fat. There were long discussions about money. I eavesdropped and gradually began to understand what was going on. My father had left a will, leaving my mother lots of money, but also dividing the rest of his fortune between my brother and me. My uncle Clément was our guardian. My grandmother was being paid a monthly stipend to take care of us. I realised that all the things my grandmother was buying me as gifts were in fact paid for by me. I felt betrayed by all of them. No one had cared enough to explain things to me. Once my mother was gone, my grandmother's attitude towards me changed. Stories about the war were told to me at every turn. Did I know that my brother had to wear the yellow Jewish star while I was frolicking in Cairo? Had I heard about the 6 million Jews who had died in concentration camps? I was 6 years old when the war broke out. How could I know anything? I often complained to Georgette, who would kiss me and soothe me with her wonderful pain perdu, French toast made with slices of stale bread and sprinkled with sugar. One day, when my grandmother had refused to let me go to a friend's house, I ran into the kitchen crying, "I hate her! She's so horrible! She dislikes me and only likes Eddie." Georgette looked at me and said in a sad voice, "Let me explain to you what happened. Last week, we removed the sheets in your room you first slept in and turned over the mattress. She found your missile. She was very upset. Someone had told her that your mother converted to Catholicism, but she did not know about you. She's very angry." I was astonished. Why had she not said anything to me? Oh, I could not understand. To please my grandmother, I offered to help her in the kitchen. Ironically, this was the only place where we seemed to get along. She wasn't a great cook, but there were a few dishes that she prepared very well. She was famous for her stuffed carp, and I dutifully sat in the kitchen peeling carrots, onions, shallots and garlic. She sliced the carp with a large butcher knife. Often she asked me to hold the fish while she banged on the knife with a hammer while I tightly closed my eyes. "The centre bone is very tough," she explained while she delicately removed the fish flesh. These moments with my grandmother were rare, however. Most of the time we argued bitterly. She had developed a new technique to deal with me. Every time I wanted to go out with my friends on the weekend, she had une crise cardiaque, a heart attack, and I had to cancel my date. If I invited friends over, her heart attack reoccurred, and she told my friends that I did not care if she died. My friends started to refuse to come to our house. My brother was no help, as he was busy with his studies. I spoke to my uncle Clément, whose favourite answer to anything was, "Here is 200 francs. Buy yourself a nice dress." This time he added, "Une jeune fille de bonne famille reste à la maison avec sa famille." A well-brought-up girl stays at home. "But it is my money," I cried in anger. "Have patience. It's only for a few more years." Georgette's kitchen was my haven. Back from school at 4, I would sit at the enamel table and start my homework, while Georgette made me a buttered tartine with thin slices of saucisson à l'ail, garlic sausage. Sometimes she plied me with petit fours that she'd bought just for me at the patisserie round the corner and hid behind some jam jars in the pantry. She did not want my grandmother, who commanded me to stay slim, to see them. Many of the lycées in Paris were closed down at the time my grandmother was considering where to place me for my new French education. During the war, the school buildings had been occupied by the Gestapo or used as headquarters for the German army brass, and thus were in serious need of refurbishment. Although normally I would have attended my own neighbourhood lycée, my grandmother and my uncle Clément agreed that it would be safer for me to travel by metro to l'École de Jeunes Filles de Neuilly, a private school for upper-middle-class families located in a townhouse in an elegant suburb. My brother's lycée was just across the street, and he could keep an eye on me. We had a long walk from the metro stop to the school, but my brother kept his silence as usual. On my first day, fear compelled me to ask him to accompany me to the door. What if the kids didn't like me? What if they made fun of my sing-song Egyptian accent? Eddie, in a moment of empathy, told me that my accent was all right, that it had improved since the day we arrived, and that he was sure there would be lots of new students. My grandmother had dressed me just as they were, yet I felt foreign and different. I was self-conscious of my tawny skin, large breasts and round hips. In Egypt, I would have been considered lovely and sexy. Here, I felt like an elephant. A bell rang, and we were told to line up by class. I found myself standing near a girl of about my height with curly brown hair. Right away, I thought she could be my friend. She didn't look much different from me. "My name is Colette. What's yours?" I said shyly. "Claudine," she responded, smiling. "You know, it's funny how you are, Colette, and Colette the writer wrote so many books about Claudine. I am new here, are you?" As I nodded yes, she added, "Then we can be friends." This first exchange would seal a friendship that still exists today. After class, we would walk together to the metro. Claudine's father had been a minister in Léon Blum's government just as the war had broken out. When the Nazis occupied Paris, her father was imprisoned, but he made a deal with the Germans, agreeing to be sent to a concentration camp if they left his family alone. A deal was struck and he was sent away, never to come back. On our first day of school, the classroom teacher read the names of all the students out loud. When it came to my name, I blushed with embarrassment when I heard her say, "Colette Sol Palacci." All the girls burst out laughing. I was given the nickname l'Egyptienne, which I hated, as I wanted above all to be French. I was a good student, except in maths. A few months after I had settled into my routine, I made a discovery, one that influenced my future. I took the metro every morning, but one particularly sleepy morning, I got out by mistake at the Pont de Neuilly, and to my surprise found myself at the beginning of a farmer's market. Not wanting to return to the metro, I started walking through the market, which happens to be one of the longest in Paris, over 10 blocks. It was early October, and I could not believe my eyes. The market was more beautiful and smelled better than the one I used to love in Cairo. Garlic piled high or braided, knobbly globes of celeriac, glossy chestnuts, muscat grapes, rosy apples, pomegranates. I wanted to try them all. But what really ignited my passion were the charcuterie stands. The smell of smoked ham and salami was more than I could bear. I bought 10 grams of saucisson sec, 10 grams of jambon de Bayonne, and was about to buy more when I realised that I was on my way to school. When and how was I going to eat all this? But the next stand had all sorts of artisanal breads, so I bought 2 rolls and decided that I would skip my first class and sit on a bench to eat my treasures. This was the beginning of a lifelong habit I had of skipping a class from time to time to escape the drudgery of my life and to find solace in things I loved to do, namely looking at food and eating it. My social life outside school was dismal. I never even considered inviting my friends over, petrified my grandmother would have one of her simulated heart attacks or start screaming at me in front of them. Life in that enormous apartment was often grim, loveless, and cold. And then my mother returned to Paris. The revolution in Egypt had sent shockwaves through my North African family's lives. Colonel Nasser took over and King Farouk was sent into exile, as were all my uncles, aunts and cousins who fled to France or South America. One of her friends had found her an apartment, but my mother did not want me there on the grounds that I'd be better taken care of by my grandmother. I wept, yelled and pleaded, but to no avail. She mentioned, as a final argument, that my guardian had made the decision. I immediately called my Uncle Clément. What were his reasons for wanting me to stay where I did not want to be, with a woman who hated me? After the first few words I heard, ones that I had grown to despise, "Une jeune fille bonne famille ne fait pas," I knew there was nothing I could do. I had to stay. Years later, on one of my trips to Paris, I asked Clément why he had insisted that I stay with my grandmother. He stoically answered, "I was afraid your mother would let you do what you wanted. Your reputation had to remain intact. I expected you to marry well." I was astonished by his reply and understood why they had been opposed to my marrying an American. At that time, marrying an American was not marrying well. My last year at school was the hardest. I was preparing for my baccalaureate and had to work very, very hard, just like all my classmates. This was the only time in my life that I lost weight. Food meant less to me than my success in the exam. The day I found out that I had passed, I told my grandmother that I wasn't coming home for dinner. My best friend Claudine and I went to a brasserie and ordered a choucroute garnie, my favourite. We ate, drank beer, and went to hear Juliette Greco, the French avant-garde singer, perform in a cave, a dark cellar music club on the left bank. I hadn't been this happy in years. The next morning, I woke up with a new faith in the possibilities life had to offer me. I was going to fight for what I wanted. I would live alone, travel, attend university, and I'd explore the sensual side of life. Pleasures that I had enjoyed in Cairo would come to me in a different way here in Paris. I was no longer l'Égyptienne. I was la Parisienne, with an attitude.
And tomorrow, La Parisienne with attitude tastes her first truffle and meets her new stepfather. Barbara Flynn was reading Return to Paris by Colette Rossant, abridged for radio by Penny Lester. The producer was Gemma Jenkins.
Je me souviens d'un coin de rue, aujourd'hui disparu.
My mother made a compromise between her duties as a mother and her much-cherished freedom, and settled alone in a one-bedroom apartment with a kitchenette in the 16th arrondissement of Paris. Occasionally, she would invite my brother and me out to lunch, never to her apartment. Sometimes, just to spite her, I ordered the most expensive dish on the menu, knowing she'd say nothing. On the way back to our grandmother's house, Eddie would scold me. "You are terrible," he'd whine. "Why did you order that dish?" I didn't know how to tell him that what I really wanted was to live with her, that hurting her was my way of getting back at her for not taking me in. I was 16 when I received a disturbing phone call. "I am married," my mother announced. Resentment and curiosity twisted my voice to shrillness as I fired questions at her. She refused to answer them, instead inviting me to lunch to meet him. "It's an excellent restaurant," my mother said dryly. "We'll have a great meal. The chef is Mira's friend." Her new husband's name made me snigger. And since when did my mother enjoy good food, I wondered? She was always complaining that she was fat and on a diet. Faugeron was on the left bank and had a Michelin star. The day of our lunch, I dressed carefully, thinking I should impress my new stepfather. I had not had a father since I was 6. What would this one be like? What role would he take in my life? Would he take my mother even farther away from me? As I pulled on creamy silk stockings and smoothed down my tight navy skirt, I daydreamed of living in a big house with them. I waited 20 minutes for the newlyweds to show up. My mother made her entrance, followed by a man who was holding the door for her and looking at her with adoration. I had to remember to close my mouth, which had opened in shock. Almire Ducreux was shorter than my mother, with a stiff grey crew cut, a small, expertly trimmed moustache, and a round belly. I was totally baffled. The large menu offered dishes I had never heard of: baked truffle over ashes, partridge terrine, foie gras sauté in a port sauce, beef en daube, stewed hare. I was relieved when Mira asked if I minded his ordering for us. My mother said she'd have an appetizer and a salad. My first course arrived engulfed by the most extraordinary, intoxicating aroma. A lone globe of aluminium foil sat on a white china plate, accompanied by thin slices of buttered toast. I didn't move, and simply allowed the scent to waft toward my nose. My stepfather, smiling gently, suggested that I open the foil. I followed every movement he made with his own silver packet. Now a black ball revealed itself, engulfed in steam, its rough patterned skin reminding me of epidermis under the microscope in my science class. "Slice it thinly and taste it," Mira said, with a mock-serious tone. I slid the slice of truffle into my mouth, and I tasted something more sublime than any other food I'd ever had. Well, I couldn't begin to describe the joy I felt eating that truffle. An epiphany of the senses. My stepfather seemed a little surprised and very pleased by my enthusiasm and my obvious pleasure in eating that truffle. The next dish was quenelle of brochet, pike. The quenelles were bathed in 2 sauces, one white, one pink. My mother took over the conversation, chatting mindlessly about having a garden, going to Mont d'Or to take the baths. She added that they were moving to a hotel near the Seine until they bought a house. I looked over at my stepfather, who was gazing at her, almost stupidly. I knew then that I would not have a place in their lives. My mother would see to that. As the menu for dessert was handed to me, both of them turned to me. "Colette does not like sweets," my mother said in a nasty tone of voice. "No, maman," I retorted rudely. "I think I will try the chocolate ganache." Why had I said that? I hated chocolate. My stepfather looked at me, smiled, and said gently, "I don't think chocolate after this meal is a good idea. How about a crêpe filled with fraises de bois?" Did I like crepes? I wasn't sure, but it was better than chocolate, and I decided then and there that I liked this man. He was kind, warm, and seemed to understand my mother and our tense relationship. The crepe came, golden and lacy. As I took a bite, it melted in my mouth, and I was left with a slightly tart, perfumed taste of the tiny wild strawberries. I must have looked very pleased, because my stepfather started to laugh. An honest, hearty laugh that came rolling from the centre of his being. I looked up at him and laughed also. My stepfather had understood my fears and had unveiled my profound love of food, which tied him to me. I did not see my mother for a few weeks after that lunch. My brother did not ask anything about our stepfather, and Grandmamma Rose refused to acknowledge that my mother had remarried. "C'est un paysan," she said with disdain. One morning, my mother called and asked if that Sunday I would come to the hotel in the late afternoon and then go out to dinner. I eagerly accepted. The hotel was near the Seine, in the 12th arrondissement, quite far from the city centre. It looked a bit shabby, and I was disappointed. As I entered the lobby, a couple were heading for the front desk in front of me. The woman stood slightly behind the man, as if to hide. My stepfather, standing behind the reception desk, handed the man a card so he could register. The man seemed to hesitate, but then filled out the card, and my stepfather handed him the key. "Second floor to the right," he said. For just 2 hours, mind you. I was fascinated by the whole exchange. My stepfather was running a love hotel by the hour. Did my mother know it? And how would my brother, prudish and stuck up, react to that news? I stood frozen in embarrassment. Mira had not seen me. Should I go out and come back in, or just ignore the whole incident and call out his name? I decided that I really didn't care what the hotel was used for. I giggled and thought of my great-aunt in Cairo, who had run a genteel whorehouse for widowers, and who the family, except for my Egyptian grandmother, had cut off. I remembered suddenly the jovial atmosphere of the place, and my great-aunt feeding me nuts while she and my Egyptian grandmother talked. I'd loved going there as a child. Mira greeted me warmly and led me to the apartment behind the desk. My mother was sitting in an armchair in a large, ugly room. "Colette, look what I'm knitting. Mira's daughter is expecting her 4th child." I had forgotten that Mira had another family. I felt jealous and angry and sat pouting in a corner. My mother had never knitted for me. Mira also had a son who was engaged to be married. "Mira doesn't like his fiancée," my mother confided, with obvious pleasure at having something to gossip about. The dinner in the local restaurant was nothing like our first lunch. It was a small bistro, and for the first time I had hareng sour, delicate herring fillets in oil and onions served with warm potatoes. It was all tasty, but didn't come close to the intense experience I had at our first lunch. During dinner, I learned that Mira was revamping his hotels in the Mont d'Or and would start out in a month, going every weekend to search for 2-star chefs to run the restaurants in the summer. Mira asked me if I'd like to join them. Our first weekend search took place in February. We drove to Florine, about 56 kilometres from Paris, where Mira explained a young chef was making a name for himself. The restaurant was tucked away in a back street. As soon as we sat down, my mother whined that she wasn't hungry and would just have a titbit. Mira turned to me with an air of complicity and said, "I'm famished. You?" "Me too," I assured him, so we began a feast. The meal started with a delicate mousse of foie gras served with onion preserves. Mira watched me as I took a bite. "How do you think it was made?" he asked me. I had no idea. "Close your eyes. Imagine the spices. Do you think there is wine in the mousse? What makes the onion jam so tangy?" I tried and failed. "Red wine? No. But certainly cream." "Yes." "The spices?" I couldn't guess. "Lemon juice?" "No." I gave up and continued to eat, feeling flushed and excited by what seemed to me a guessing game of the senses. To appreciate a dish, Colette, you must know what's in it. It is important to remember the taste. Food is memory. If you can remember this lunch in a week, then the food was memorable and worth your while. I will teach you. For the next 3 months, I followed my stepfather in his quest for new chefs. We did not talk much during these trips. We just ate, and the food was our bond that grew stronger and stronger every year. As my relationship with my stepfather solidified, other problems arose. Mira had decided that Claude, his son, should marry me. I was turning 17 and had just passed my baccalaureate. Claude and I had met several times at family functions, barely talking to one another. He was short like his father, with thinning auburn hair. His fiancée, Suzanne, was always there, shunned by my mother and Mira. One day Claude phoned and asked me to dinner at a café on the Champs-Élysées. As we sat down, Claude announced that in 2 months he would marry Suzanne. "I don't want to marry you," he said. "I don't either," I replied. "I don't even like you." Claude's nostrils flared when he heard my nasty retort. But he needed my help, so his expression softened. He pleaded with me to convince my stepfather that under no circumstances would I marry his son. I promised that I would try, and we finished our dinner in silence, having nothing much in common. The next weekend, Mira told me that we were going to Salon de Provence in the south of France to look at a new inn and talk to the chef. As we were waiting for dinner that evening, I asked Mira to take a walk through the herb garden. I told Mira I could not marry his son. I hoped he would understand and still consider me his daughter. Mira sighed, picked a sprig of lavender and handed it to me. Years later, when James, my American fiancé, came for me in Paris, the only one who greeted him with open arms was my stepfather. They would sit together in the garden and talk about French politics, chain smoking. When we caused a scandal by living together in Munich before we were even married, Mira was the only one who stood by my side and defended me. Mira died in 1961, weeks before coming to the United States to visit me and my new family. My mother, widowed for the second time and alone in Paris, moved to New York, right across the street from our house, more than ever a stranger to me.
And tomorrow, Barbara Flynn reads the fourth instalment of Return to Paris by Colette Rossant. It was abridged by Penny Lester, and the producer was...
Despite the nun's warnings, Colette begins to discover boys as well as food. The reader is Barbara Flynn.
Je me souviens d'un coin de rue, aujourd'hui disparu.
I was 16 and didn't have a boyfriend. I had not left the convent in Cairo long enough to forget what the nuns used to say to us nearly every day. Don't flirt with boys. Virginity is the most precious gift of all. Precious gift? For whom? At night, when I was aching with loneliness or felt the need to be hugged or kissed, as in the novels I read, I ended up in the kitchen, barefoot, in my nightgown, eating thick slices of saucisson sec with a piece of baguette. In March, we all had to have a physical check-up. A doctor was to come to the school and perfunctorily check our heartbeat, blood pressure and teeth. If he felt anything was amiss, a note would be sent to our parents, and then we had to be thoroughly examined by our own doctor. I hated my gym class, held Thursday afternoons, and instead wanted to walk on the left bank and explore Paris. My friend Judith had a brilliant idea. When the doctor comes and it's your turn, run up the stairs very fast and chew on blotting paper. It will raise your body temperature and the doctor will think you have heart disease. It worked. My grandmother got a letter stating that until I was checked out by my own physician, I could not take gym class. Our doctor was a man in his late 30s. As we sat in his office, he stared at me, and I stared back, mentally imploring him to find something wrong with me. He listened carefully to my heart while my grandmother looked on. Again I stared directly at the doctor, right into his eyes. I remembered my Egyptian grandmother saying that all Palachi women were witches, and if I wanted something badly enough, I could send a message with my eyes. The doctor cocked his head in confusion, turned to my grandmother and said in a low voice, "Elle a des yeux de boudoir. Ils sont superbes, mais elle a aussi un souffle au cœur, donc pas de gymnastique. She has bedroom eyes. They are superb, but she also has a heart murmur, so no gym classes." I felt elated. But then he added that I had to be on a diet and not eat any fat. What about butter, cream, cheese, all the things I loved? On a diet, he repeated, for at least 2 months. For years after that, I never knew if I had a souffle au cœur. And I don't know if he felt he'd given me what I wanted, but I had to pay the price. My grandmother made me eat salad and cold ham that evening, while she and my brother regaled themselves on soft scrambled eggs with heavy cream and truffle juice, served with boiled new potatoes. A dish I loved. One day in early May, my brother came to me and asked if I would join his friends and him in a play they were going to produce for their school. The play, Gide's Oedipus Rex, was going to be performed in the local theatre. They needed a woman to play the role of Oedipus's mother. That Saturday, I went with my brother to his school to meet the cast. Gérard, a boy of about 18, was Oedipus. A tall blonde boy called Georges was Creon. After the rehearsals, Georges, Gérard, my brother and I would end up in a café. The three of them discussed politics, theatre, books, and sometimes girls. I always tried not to eat too much in front of these wonderful boys, realizing quickly that food and wine were not important to them. Sometimes I took the plat du jour, especially if it was blanquette de veau, a veal stew with lemon and cream. I loved that dish, and even today I make it whenever I feel nostalgic. The rehearsals took 3 months of blissful Saturdays. The day of the performance, my jitters were overshadowed by a feeling of doom. What would I do on Saturdays? Would I see them again? I must have expressed my sorrow as I recited the lines. As the curtain fell down, the audience roared with delight, and Georges and Gérard hugged me. Even my brother smiled at me. A week later, as I was leaving school, I saw Gérard and Georges waving to me from across the street to come and join them. "Come to the café with us. We want to talk to you." My prayers were answered. They were going to ask me to join them for another play. There was a moment of silence while we waited for our coffee. I looked at Georges. Really looked at him for the first time. He was tall, thin with blondish hair and a long French nose. He wore blue trousers, an elegant white shirt and a navy blue sweater wrapped around his shoulders. My gaze went to Gérard, and I smiled inadvertently. As usual, Gérard's clothes were in disarray. His brown sweater had holes at the elbows, his curly brown hair was too long, and his eyeglasses gave his face an owlish look. I felt comfortable with him and liked his sense of humour. The silence continued, and both of them were looking down at their coffee. Suddenly, Georges started to talk. "Colette, this is hard to say, but we—" and he stopped, blushing deeply. "We are both in love with you. We don't know who you like best. We've been fighting and have decided that you have to choose." I looked at both incredulously. Choose? But how? Which one? This was ridiculous. "I don't know. I love you both. How must I choose?" "You can kiss each one in turn and then decide," Gérard said with a smile. I looked down at my empty cup of coffee, wondering what the correct answer was. I'd never kissed a boy before, nor did I know how. Georges then said in a whisper, "Come, let's go next door inside the apartment building and kiss." I got up and followed him like a stupid puppy. We entered the courtyard of the building next door, and he embraced me awkwardly and kissed me with a closed, dry-lipped mouth. He's too tall, I thought, and his lips are chapped. I wanted to tell him to try again, but was afraid. We went out on the street again, and Gérard was waiting outside the building. Now it was his turn. I suddenly felt like laughing. If only my grandmother could see me now, she would have a real heart attack. Gérard bent down toward me, tilted my head up with his hand under my chin, and looked into my eyes. "You have such beautiful eyes, and I do love you." I felt as if a wave was hitting me in the chest. I lifted my head toward him and kissed him. As we went out, I looked at Georges and felt sorry for him. "It's him," I said, pointing to Gérard. Georges walked away, his head bent, shuffling his feet. From then on, Gérard met me outside the school gate and walked me home. I hid the poems he wrote to me under my mattress. At night I'd take them out and read them again and again, as well as his many letters in which he revealed his carnal desires for me. My grandmother found them. She called his parents and asked them to be sure that Gérard never came close to me. I cried and screamed at my grandmother, who looked at me with scorn. "You're like your mother. Nothing good will ever come your way." One day in July, while we were having lunch, the telephone rang. My grandmother spoke in English. She sounded excited. When she came back to the table, she said, "It was the son of an old friend of ours from America. He is coming to lunch tomorrow with his friends. Colette, I told him you will show him Paris." The next day my grandmother decided to make a quiche Lorraine, followed by a tomato salad, add raspberries with crème fraîche for dessert. I was sent shopping, told to buy cheeses and bread, and to make the tomato salad. By noon, everyone was impatient to see this young American and his friends. Finally, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and was faced with a very tall young man with grey-green eyes, thin and very handsome. "I am Jimmy. You must be Colette. This is my friend Les." We sat down to lunch. "This food is great. I've never had such a wonderful tomato salad. Who made it?" I said I did, and he smiled at me and said again and again, "It's great salad, great salad." Now he jokes that he married me because of the tomato salad. For the next week we were inseparable. I showed him Paris, took him and Les to the opera, where we were thrown out because we laughed so much, visited the Left Bank and every church and important building that he had heard of. Gérard was forgotten. Again I was in love, this time with a tall American. The day before Jimmy left to continue his trip, my grandmother invited him to Nile on the Atlantic coast, where we were going to spend a month. We swam, lunched, swam again, dined, always in the company of my grandmother and brother. I was getting quite desperate. On the fourth day, Jimmy announced that he had caught a cold and was staying in bed. I was dispatched to bring him some chicken consommé. I quietly knocked at the door of his room, went in, and found him asleep. I put the soup on the table and looked at him sleeping. He was so handsome. I bent down and kissed him lightly. He grabbed my hand and kissed it. We both laughed. I sat on his bed and we talked. How to get rid of my brother, my grandmother, and be together, we asked each other. I had a brilliant idea. My grandmother was very vain and liked to flirt with men. An elderly gentleman staying at the hotel had befriended her. I said to Jimmy that I would go and talk to him and ask him to help us. For the next few days, the elderly gentleman took my grandmother away on rides, visiting churches and mainly flirting with her, which made her very happy. To get rid of my brother, Jimmy told him he wanted to sketch the small churches in the countryside and that I would help him carry his watercolours. My brother, who preferred the beach and swimming, never came along. I followed Jimmy everywhere, watching him sketch the local fishermen, village scenes, and me. We talked about school, my mother, what I wanted to do after graduating from high school. 2 days before Jimmy had to leave for Paris, Jim turned to me and said, "Will you marry me?" I was silent for just a moment. "Of course I will marry you. I love you. But don't say anything to my grandmother. Wait until you're back in Paris and my mother will be there. We will tell her then." When we returned to Paris, I called my mother and asked her to come and meet Jimmy. As we all sat down in the living room, I proudly announced that Jimmy had proposed and that we were going to get married. Utter silence preceded an explosion. My grandmother said, "Never." My mother said, "That's stupid. You're only 16. He has no profession and he can't support you." My grandmother turned to Jimmy and continued her tirade. "How dare you? Under my roof. What would your mother say? I was sobbing at this point, exaggerating the noise of my weeping and blowing my nose loudly. My mother suddenly said in a loud, calm, imperious voice, "I have the solution. Colette, stop crying immediately. You must finish your baccalaureate. Jimmy must graduate from Harvard, and only then can he return. If you both feel the same as you do now, you can get married." Jimmy and I looked at each other and smiled. "I can wait," I said. I had to wait 3 long years before he came back for me.
And Colette's recollections of France conclude tomorrow at the same time. Return to Paris by Colette Rossant was read by Barbara Flynn, abridged by Penny Lester, and produced by Gemma Jenkins.
This is
BBC Radio 4
Extra.
Now we have more in our thrilling serial that's set in 1890s Whitechapel. Meg has travelled from Wales to London to visit her brother, who's running the family's dairy.
Je me souviens d'un coin de rue, aujourd'hui disparu.
I was enjoying a velvety onion soup, topped with a layer of melted Gruyere, when my Uncle Clement threw a bombshell at my feet. "I am sending you to Egypt. You have to go there. Albert is contesting the government's edict about accountancy fees, and they need you in Cairo." When my father died, he left his fortune to be managed by his eldest brother, my Uncle Albert. Egyptian law, however, was very strict about children's inheritance. The government had created a department that was responsible for managing the child's portion of all inheritances. An auditor, to be paid by the estate, was assigned to each account. When Nasser took over the government, exiling King Farouk, he ordered a review of all the orphans' accounts. At this point, the new government declared that our family's accountant had been underpaid for the last 10 years and that adjustments had to be made. I would have been thrilled by Uncle Clement's proclamation 2 years ago, but now my Egyptian grandparents were dead, and I wanted to stay in Paris to study or to work. "I don't want to go," I said in a self-assured voice that surprised me. "I want to register at the Sorbonne and take a degree in—" What did I want to study? I really didn't know. English and literature, I finished, thinking of my fiancé Jimmy in America. "It's only until this summer," he explained. "Next autumn you can go to school if you still want to. Now go back home and pack your bags and all your belongings, and I will give you a studio in one of my apartment buildings. Leave them there and go to Cairo." I looked at my uncle in astonishment. What had happened? He was actually going to let me live on my own? I decided not to ask, but to do what he told me and quickly move out of the house. My studio was on the 8th floor of a very elegant building on the Avenue Foch. The room was small, with one window, a tiny bathroom, a bed, a desk, and a chair. Clement was there with me to introduce me to the concierge. This concierge was to look after me, meaning, I understood, to report to Clement what I was doing, where I went, and especially who came to the attic to visit. I knew I had to behave. If not, this small studio would be taken from me. I flew to Cairo a week later. The noise from the crowds at the airport was almost deafening, and soldiers with guns were milling about everywhere. The house was as lovely as I remembered, with red and white bougainvillea growing on the fence. As I entered my grandparents' apartment, I was suddenly filled with sadness. I had been so happy here with them. But now my Uncle Albert and his wife were living in their apartment. They greeted me warmly, and soon I felt more at ease. My room was unchanged, and from the balcony I could still touch the mango tree that my grandfather said he had planted when I was born. Then I drifted towards the kitchen. Ahmed, our cook, was still there. When my mother left me with my grandparents, Ahmed had taken me into his kitchen. He would plop me on the marble counter and give me the spoon filled with a chocolate mousse he was making, or he would fill a small pitter with hot foule mesdames that he made for the kitchen staff. Today, he looked older and thinner, but his smile was as warm as I remembered it. He hugged me and told me I looked beautiful, but too thin. He would cook for me all the dishes he remembered I liked. I was home. I promised myself that this time I would ask him to teach me how to prepare some of his dishes, like his grilled quail, stuffed vine leaves, and pickled garlic. The following Monday we went together to the market. Ahmed showed me how to choose aubergines for the babaganu. From there we went to buy quails for dinner. The quails were so much smaller than in Paris. I remembered how my grandfather and I had a little game of who would leave fewer bones on the plate after eating 3 quails. It seemed to me that from the outside, the revolution and the new regime had not affected my family, but in reality it had. Business was bad, and the government was harassing the Europeans and the Jews. New regulations on import and export were piling up on my Uncle Albert's desk, changing every day. When, after a few days, I tried to find out what was going on with my trial, my uncle told me that he was taking care of everything. It wasn't for a young woman like me to bother with these details. I was here to meet people, have fun, and hopefully get married. Now I understood why Clement had sent me back to Cairo. I was 19 and had to get married, or I would become an old maid. So I didn't ask about my uncle's legal appeal again. Instead, I was dragged to the sporting club each morning to go swimming and flirt with boys, who happened to disapprove of bikinis, to my dismay. In the afternoon, my aunt took me shopping. According to her, I needed lots of new dresses to go dancing in. My cousin Renee, who was my age and also unmarried, told me to be careful. "Don't go out alone with a man more than twice," she warned me. "If you do, they will announce your engagement. Try to go in a group or with me." Every Friday, I was invited to dinner with one or another member of my family. There was always a young man there, and often he invited me out on the balcony to look at the stars, announcing that his future wife would get a large diamond and lots of servants to do her bidding. I was unimpressed. Time in the kitchen with Ahmed was the best part of my day. I learned how to make sanbusaks, wonderful small pastries filled with cheese, mouloukhaya, the green herb soup, stuffed vegetables with rice and meat, and my favourite dessert, loukoumades, tiny fried balls of dough rolled in honey. One night at dinner, I was seated next to a tall, blonde man of about 30 who didn't seem Egyptian. During dinner, I learned that his parents were Hungarians, but that he had been born in Cairo. He had gone to school in France before the war and was an architect. He talked to me about an Egyptian architect called Hussein Fatih, who was using vernacular Egyptian architectural forms in building modern houses. If I was interested, he would be happy to show me some of these buildings. This was the first time in months that I met someone that interested me, so for the next few days I allowed Philip to take me around. I had a very good time with Philip, and at night I went dancing with him. My family was ecstatic, and Tante Becca wrote to my mother in Paris that finally, soon, she hoped, I would be engaged to be married. My mother, upon receiving this news, wrote to her best friend Alice in Boston that I was getting married. Alice ran an art store in Cambridge nearby. Jimmy, who was then studying architecture at Harvard, happened to know her. The day my mother's letter arrived at the store, Jimmy came in to buy supplies, and Alice told him the great news. Jimmy, as he would tell me later, ran out of the store and sent me a telegram, which read, "Don't marry anyone but me. I love you." The telegram was like lightning hitting me. I hadn't heard from him in many months, and though I had not forgotten him, I thought that he had forsaken me. I showed the telegram to my aunt. "I'm going back to Paris," I said. I want to marry Jimmy. You must help me convince Uncle Albert." My aunt decided that the best way was to go and see a sheikh, who was a well-known clairvoyant. She said he could tell the future. The next day we drove outside the city to a small village. We stopped in front of a stone house with open windows and an inner courtyard filled with goats and pigeons. A young barefoot Arab boy led us to a small room where an old man in a long robe was sitting on the floor munching on roasted melon seeds. We sat on cushions, and while my aunt explained in Arabic why we were there, I stared at him. If I looked right into his eyes, maybe I could convey to him my wishes. The sheikh asked my aunt for a handkerchief that belonged to me. As he sniffed the handkerchief, he said to my aunt not to keep me here any longer. I would end up far away on another continent with a tall, dark-haired man. She would never see me again, but I would be happy, and it was the will of Allah that I go. It was written in the stars. My aunt was astonished, and I was elated. At dinner that night, my aunt told Uncle Albert that he had to send me back. The trial with the government was going nowhere, and I no longer needed to stay. It was early May when I returned to my minuscule empty flat in Paris, and I was overjoyed. I walked endlessly through the Marché aux Puces, an enormous flea market with alleys hiding copper pots, old rugs, dusty jewellery, and clothes from another era. I bought a dresser, 2 posters of American film stars, and a large vase. The large oak dresser dominated my room, but I couldn't return it, so I put the vase full of magnificent tulips on it. With the posters on the wall and the smell of coffee wafting up from an apartment below, it was home. A letter from Jimmy was on my table. He was graduating from Harvard and was going to be drafted into the army. He was sent to Munich, in Germany. He asked me to visit him. I went to see my mother and stepfather and announced that I was leaving for Munich. My mother started to cry, only because she was worried about what people would say. But my stepfather gave me his unequivocal blessing. Jimmy was waiting at the train station. Once I was wrapped in his long arms, I knew I had made the right decision. He had reserved a room in a hotel in Schwabing. All I remember about that night was that we made love on what seemed like every surface in the room. The next morning, I woke up and looked at Jimmy sleeping next to me. I bent down and kissed him. I kissed him hard. He was my lover, and I loved him more than anything in the world. The day of my wedding, my stepfather reserved a room for us at the Hotel Plaza Athénée. When the reception was over, we were driven there. As we were about to go to bed, the telephone rang. It was Jimmy's friend. He was downstairs in the bar with all the young people from the wedding. "Come down, it's too early to go to bed. Come and celebrate with us." We were up until dawn. 40 years later, I wrote to the Plaza Athénée, asking for the same room we had enjoyed on our wedding night. Not only did we get the same room, we were charged the 1955 price. That night, the Plaza invited us to their restaurant. The chef to whom I'd written about what I liked in 1955 organised the menu. We started with baked truffles. As we opened the foil packets and inhaled their aroma, memories of my first truffle with my stepfather flew into my head. I had loved that first truffle so much. And now, after the first bite, the same wonderful, exciting feeling that here I was eating something so special came back to me. This dish was followed by tender fillets of sole with almond butter, followed by a small sorbet of pear with eau de vie, then a tender pink rack of baby lamb, next a salad, and finally the most wonderful hot chocolate cake topped with the year 1955 made of spun sugar. We drank several bottles of wine. Drunk and happy, we went back to our room. And that night, no one woke us up.
Barbara Flynn was reading the final part of Return to Paris by Colette Rossant. It was abridged for radio by Penny Lester and the producer was Gemma Jenkins. All next week at this time, the fascinating story of how fabrics have shaped our world, from the linens which wrap the bodies of Egyptian pharaohs to the murky wartime history of rayon.